Hey guys, Yamakiller here, back again with another what decks to play this week in each format. Today we're going to be going over the 6 main formats for Constructed right now: Standard, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, Vintage, and Pauper. Now some of these formats I play on a weekly basis, some of them I play on a daily basis, some of them I play on a monthly basis. I'll be telling you which ones I am not necessarily as inclined to play and therefore don't have as much knowledge, although I do talk to people that usually talk about basically all of these formats all of the time. So I have at least a little bit of knowledge, whether it be first hand or second hand. And before we get into it, I want to ask you a couple things. First, if you like these videos that I make sure to like this YouTube video, subscribe to the channel, comment, like, all that good stuff. And yeah, let's get into it. First, Standard, as I've said many times in the past, as you probably know from my stream, as you probably know from my YouTube, as you probably know from me as a person, I do not play Standard nearly at all. And this Standard format is not an exception. But I still do talk to people who play Standard on a weekly basis for SCG events, for PTQs, for the Pro Tour testing, all these things. These are the things that I've been told. Couple decks coming up now. Regularly, there's the 2 decks from the previous format, still reasonably good. Esper Doom Foretold, a controlling deck that tries to use Doom Foretold along with Yorion Sky Nomad to accrue a lot of value, and then win with something like Dance of the Manse or casting an Amiria's Call to make some angels. Some way to win in the end, but essentially the point of the deck is just being a controlling Esper deck with enchantments. Now there's the classic Gruul deck, Embercleave sort of thing, just trying to kill our opponents pretty quickly. Now this deck list has foregone the Great Henge and added some blue lands to be able to play Negate in the board, but regularly this deck is like Great Henge plus Embercleave plus some creatures like Kazandu Mammoth, Brushfire Elemental, Edgewall Innkeeper, plus some adventures to get some value. Basically, you are the aggro deck that also has some longer game and some cheese elements. Now, a new deck for the Standard format, Sultai Control, I believe it is, uses Emergent Ultimatum plus some variation of cards in the deck to kill your opponent. This is a new deck from Jabberwocky, and Jabberwocky I've stolen many decks from in the past for many different formats, and I've done fairly well. So even if I don't necessarily understand how the deck works right now, it's the deck that I would more than likely be happy to pick up, as Jabberwocky is a god amongst men when it comes to deck building. Now that we're done with Standard, let us move on to Pioneer, another format I have not played necessarily all that much, although I did watch a good chunk of it over the past weekend, and saw Canister make a very deep run, and by a deep run I mean win, the Pioneer Challenge with a Niv to Light deck list using the power of the new card Valky, along with Niv and Omnath and Uro and all these very, very busted cards. And with Uro being banned probably in this format in the next week, it seems more than likely that it is the card that you should be playing. So this is one of those decks that you can be playing that is reasonable to play. It is not the easiest deck to play. Tapping mana is a little bit difficult with your 5 colors of mana. You do have some fetch lands like Fabled Passage, and you've got to have a good idea of what exactly your game plan is. But this deck is very powerful, uses a lot of very busted cards. Valky plus Bring to Light allows you to do a 5 mana Planeswalker. Just getting a lot of mana is not that hard with Omnath. You have Niv plus Teferi plus Uro. Lots and lots of good things going on here. If you want something a bit easier, there's 2 other decks I'd suggest to you. Mono Green Planeswalkers. Don't have to sideboard. Fairly reasonable. It's not necessarily going to be the best deck, but it has some nut draws and it has some very, very good applications with like Karn the Great Creator getting some good sideboard cards for you. Now, another deck that I think is very busted is this Oops All Spells deck. Kills on turn 3 fairly consistently and has good answers to hate with Leyline, Abrupt Decay, Reclamation Sage, and has obviously Hate for the Mirror in the other Leyline. So these are the decks that I would be willing to play for Pioneer and I think are good. Now, in Modern, we have a bit of a problem. By a problem, I mean there is a clear tier 0 deck, and it is this blue-based Valky deck. You get to play Forced Negation to deal with a lot of the things your opponent can do to kill you quickly. You get to cast Valky on turn 2 fairly consistently with either Simian Spirit Guide or Gemstone Caverns. You have lots of interaction in the form of Teferi, Cryptic Command. You even get to play Uro in your deck. There's loads of ways to build this deck. This isn't necessarily the optimal way, because I think in the weekend's PTQ, there's going to be a lot of people playing Valky, and in the mirrors, Uro's not necessarily that great. You can play some more tech cards and some more Mystical Disputes in the main deck, some more Brazen Borrowers, possibly some Commandeers to steal their Valky, but the idea is that this deck is tier 0. I'm not going to be talking about basically any other deck, because playing any other deck if you want to win is a mistake. There's some decks that have some reasonable matchups against this deck, possibly, like Burn could possibly have a reasonable matchup depending on how you build your deck. hammer time, depending on how you build your deck. There's some decks that try to kill you very consistently by turn 3 or 4, or sometimes even 2 with something like Oops All Spells or Belcher. But those decks have not necessarily the greatest matchup range across the entire field. And while there is a clear tier 0 deck, in Modern, people like to play what they like to play. So you have to build your deck sometimes in accordance with that. And basically, Valky is the tier 0 deck, and I would not try to play a deck to beat Valky. I would instead just play Valky. It's going to get banned basically on Monday. They've said they're going to ban Uro. They're probably going to change the ruling on Valky to make it so you can't cascade into it. If you want to get free money, unless you play a bunch of Valky mirrors and lose some coin flips, I would highly, highly suggest playing this deck. I think it's the best deck in the format, and basically a mistake if you want to win your competitive tournament this weekend, play this deck. It's just the best thing to be doing. That's all that I can say about Modern. It's a sad state that we're in, but luckily they're going to be banning some things on Monday, so we don't have to deal with Valky for much longer. At least we hope, crossing our fingers. Now, let us look at Legacy. Another format. What do you know? Cascade into Valky. Not the greatest thing for most formats, it seems. This deck won one of the Legacy challenges this weekend. I think this deck is fairly good. I'm not necessarily sure that it is better than some of the other decks, but it's clearly tier 1. You got to play Force Negation, Force of Will, Misdirection, Mystical Dispute. You even get to play Oko Thief of Crowns. You get 8 Spirit Guides. You very, very consistently cast Valky on even turn 1, but very consistently on turn 2. I would highly suggest this as one of the decks to be playing this weekend. But if you're not too into Valky, I think the other decks that are reasonable, Temur Delver is still a very, very reasonable deck. Daze, Force of Will, Force Negation, still got answers to Valky. I think you can even build your deck very specifically to beat Valky if you expect a lot of decks to be playing it. You can play Spell Pierces, you can play Stifle. Stifle really, really good against the Valky decks because it stops the Cascade and can very rarely be hit by Misdirection. So it stops some of their avenue to stop you. You can also play Snoko, but although the 2 decks that I would play in this format basically be Rug Delver or Valky, I'm not necessarily sure how strong Valky is. It's possibly correct that just Rug Delver is still just the best deck, but Valky is definitely up there as a choice. Let us move on to Vintage. There's some clear choices in Vintage. You've got 4 different choices. You've got Workshop, you've got Bazaar, you've got Fair Blue decks, and you've got Combo Blue decks. Personally, I'm going to be playing a Combo Blue deck of sort. I've been having fun playing Oath of Druids. I'm going to be playing some Ren and 6s, some Okos, and Oath of Druids to try and get a Grizzlebrand or a Niv Mizzet out. I find this deck fun. I'm not necessarily sure it's the best deck by any means, but it's a deck that I have fun with. Though, if you want to be aggressive, play Workshop with Arcbound Ravager and some Fleetwheel Cruisers. If you want to be degenerate, play some Bazaar Baghdad. If you want to be combo-y, play Doomsday, Paradoxical Outcome. There's a bunch of different variations and strategies. Basically, whatever archetype you like to be playing in Vintage, there's tons and tons of things you can be doing. Fair Blue and Jeskai and Sultai as well, along with some 4-color decks. Even Uro, if you don't want to play Uro in the other formats, there's always Vintage. Uro, while not the greatest, is still a somewhat respectable card in Vintage. So you can also play Uro and Deathrite Traum and all these other cards that have been banned in many other formats. Now, finally, on to Pauper. Personally, I've been having a lot of fun playing this Blue-Red Fairies deck. I'm not necessarily sure if this is the greatest up-to-date deck list. I haven't added some of the snow cards. There's a bunch of new cards that came out in the new set, the Foretell cards that have been fairly good in Pauper that I've seen, but I'm not exactly sure how to build those decks. But personally, the decks that I would be playing is Blue-Red Fae, Tron, and you can mess around with some Red-White Monarch, you can mess around with some Affinity, some Burn, some Elves, but these 2 decks, I think Blue-Red and Tron, or some version of the Fairies deck, is the way to go. Now, hopefully you learned something, you got some information that you found useful, something to help you out in one of these formats over the next weekend, where there's a Legacy PTQ, there's Modern PTQ, there's challenges, there's SCG, and all these other big events. And hopefully some of the information that I gave you today will be useful. If you liked the video, make sure to like, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitch and Twitter in the description below. I will be playing a bunch of events this weekend, and comment and tell me what you think about the video. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. I'll see you guys next week for what decks to play then. Bye-bye.